The dust storm had come without warning, sending the citizens of Tulsa, Oklahoma scurrying for shelter like frightened jackrabbits. All except for Grace Daniels, who stood frozen on the boardwalk, her honey blonde hair whipping wildly about her face as she stared at the imposing white building across the street. The Wells Fargo Bank might as well have been a gallows for all the dread it inspired in her heart. The year was 1879, and Grace was about to lose everything she'd ever worked for. The drought had devastated her small ranch just outside town, leaving her cattle thin and her crops withered. The loan she'd taken out 3 years prior, after her father's passing, now loomed over her like a hangman's noose. "Miss Daniels," a voice called out over the howling wind, "you ought to get inside before this storm takes you clear to Kansas." Grace turned to see Sheriff Miller waving frantically from the doorway of his office. With one last glance at the bank, she nodded and hurried across the street, ducking inside just as a violent gust threatened to lift her off her feet. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, brushing dust from her simple blue dress. "I was just gathering my courage." The aging lawman's eyes softened with understanding. "Bank business today," Grace nodded, her throat suddenly too tight for words. "Well, you take care in there," he said, patting her shoulder awkwardly. "That new banker from back east is all business, I hear." The storm passed quickly, as they often did in Oklahoma territory. When Grace finally crossed the street and climbed the steps to the bank's entrance, her heart hammered against her ribs like a wild Mustang fighting capture. The cool interior offered relief from the heat, but none from her anxiety. "Miss Daniels," the clerk acknowledged with a curt nod. "Mr. Prescott is expecting you." She was led to a small office at the rear of the building where a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose sat behind a desk cluttered with papers. "Miss Daniels, please sit," Mr. Prescott said without looking up. "I have the foreclosure papers ready for your signature." I was hoping we might discuss an extension," Grace said, lowering herself into the chair across from him. "The drought has been particularly harsh this year, but with a little more time, Miss Daniels," Prescott interrupted, finally meeting her gaze. "Wells Fargo has been more than patient. Your father's loan was restructured upon his death, and you've received 2 extensions already." "I'm afraid there's nothing more to discuss." Grace felt the room spin slightly. Her father had built that ranch from nothing, and now, because of a few bad seasons and her own failings, it would all be lost. She thought of the 5 ranch hands who depended on her for their livelihoods, of old Martha who kept house, and of the promise she'd made to her father on his deathbed. "The papers, Miss Daniels," Prescott said, sliding a stack of documents across the desk. Grace's vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. Not here. Not in front of this man who saw her only as a failed business venture. She reached for the pen he offered, but her hand trembled so violently she couldn't grasp it. The door to the office opened with a creak, and a deep voice drawled, "Pardon the intrusion, but I believe I have an appointment after Miss Daniels." Grace turned to find herself looking up at one of the tallest men she'd ever seen. Dust clung to his dark denim pants and the shoulders of his worn leather vest. A cowboy hat hung from one hand, revealing hair as black as a raven's wing. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes, a startling blue, were kind. "You'll have to wait, Mr. Webster," Prescott said irritably. "We're conducting business." "Of course," the cowboy replied, but instead of leaving, he moved to stand beside Grace. She noticed his spurs didn't jingle when he walked, a mark of an experienced rider who knew that unnecessary noise could spook cattle. Grace reached again for the pen, determined to maintain her dignity even as her dreams crumbled around her. Her hands shook even worse now, betraying her distress. Without a word, the cowboy reached down, his sun-bronzed hand steadying hers. "Take your time, madam," he said softly, his voice for her ears alone. "Some decisions shouldn't be rushed." The simple kindness from this stranger was nearly her undoing. She looked up at him, blinking back tears, and found nothing but compassion in his gaze. Samuel Webster, he introduced himself with a slight incline of his head. New to these parts. Grace Daniels, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Prescott cleared his throat pointedly. If you could conclude your business, Miss Daniels, I have other appointments. Samuel's hand remained over Grace's for a moment longer before he stepped back, but he didn't leave the office as Prescott clearly wished he would. Instead, he stood by the window, gazing out at the dusty street as if he had all the time in the world. Grace took a deep breath and signed the papers, each signature feeling like another nail in the coffin of her dreams. When she finished, she stood on shaky legs, nodding stiffly to Prescott before turning to leave. Miss Daniels, Samuel called after her. Might I have a word with you after my business here? Perhaps at the cafe across the street. Grace hesitated, uncertain why this stranger would want to speak with her, but something in his steady gaze made her nod in agreement. I'll wait for you there, Mr. Webster. The cafe was nearly empty when Grace entered, most folks still cleaning up after the dust storm. She chose a table by the window and ordered coffee she couldn't afford, but today of all days, she'd allow herself this small comfort. 15 minutes later, Samuel Webster pushed through the cafe door, ducking his tall frame beneath the low doorway. He spotted her immediately and crossed to her table, removing his hat as he approached. "Thank you for waiting, Miss Daniels," he said, taking the seat across from her. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her empty coffee cup. At her nod, he signaled the waitress for 2 fresh cups before turning back to Grace. "I apologize for intruding on your private business at the bank." "There's no need for apologies, Mr. Webster. I appreciate your kindness in a difficult moment." The coffee arrived and Samuel waited until the waitress had gone before speaking again. "I couldn't help but overhear your situation. You're losing your ranch." Grace stiffened slightly. "Yes, my father's ranch. 3 generations of Daniels have worked that land. And now Wells Fargo will sell it to the highest bidder," Samuel said, his expression thoughtful. "Unless someone were to pay off the loan directly." Hope flared briefly in Grace's chest before dying. "I've tried everything, Mr. Webster. No one in Tulsa will lend to a woman alone, especially not with the drought." Samuel took a sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim of his cup. "What if I were to make you a proposition, Miss Daniels?" Grace's back straightened. "Mr. Webster, if you're suggesting something improper, good heavens, no," he said quickly, his eyes widening. "Nothing of the sort. I've recently come into some money from my late uncle's estate in Colorado. I'm looking to invest in land here in Oklahoma Territory." "And you want my ranch," Grace said flatly, disappointment settling heavy in her stomach. "Another vulture, just better mannered than most." "I want to invest in your ranch," Samuel corrected gently. "As a silent partner. You would maintain control of operations, and I would provide the capital to clear the debt and make improvements." Grace stared at him, suspicious. "Why would you do that? You don't know me or my ranch." "I know good land when I see it," he replied. "I rode past your property yesterday. Despite the drought, it's clear the soil is rich. The location near Tulsa is advantageous for shipping cattle, and—" He paused, a slight smile touching his lips. "I admire determination, Miss Daniels. Not many would have fought so hard to save their family legacy." Grace wanted desperately to believe him, but experience had taught her to be wary. "What would you expect in return, Mr. Webster?" "A fair percentage of the profits once the ranch is producing again, and your expertise." "I know cattle, Miss Daniels, but I'm new to this territory." "Your knowledge would be invaluable. This seems too good to be true," Grace said honestly. Samuel chuckled. "Perhaps, but sometimes fortune smiles on us when we least expect it." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small card. "Here's where I'm staying. Think about my offer overnight. If you're interested, meet me at the bank tomorrow morning at 9, and we'll speak with Mr. Prescott together." Grace took the card, her fingers brushing against his. For a brief moment, she felt a spark of something that had nothing to do with business propositions or ranching. "I'll think about it," she promised. That night, Grace sat on the porch of her ranch house, watching as the last light faded from the western sky. The familiar sounds of the ranch settling for the night surrounded her horses nickering softly in the barn, Chuck the old ranch hand playing his harmonica by the bunkhouse, cicadas beginning their nightly chorus. In 2 weeks, none of this would be hers, unless she accepted Samuel Webster's offer. She'd asked around town about him after leaving the cafe. No one knew much. He'd arrived in Tulsa just 3 days ago, staying at Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house. He'd visited the land office and the cattle auction. He kept to himself but was unfailingly polite. Nothing suspicious, but nothing particularly reassuring either. "You're mighty quiet tonight, Miss Grace," Martha said, bringing her a cup of tea before sitting in the rocker beside her. The housekeeper had been with the family since before Grace was born. "I met someone today," Grace said, watching Martha's eyebrows rise. "Not like that, a businessman. He's offered to invest in the ranch, pay off the bank." Martha's weathered face remained carefully neutral. "And what does he want in return? A partnership?" "He says he'll be a silent partner, let me run things." "Men say a lot of things," Martha observed. "Especially to pretty young women in desperate situations," Grace sighed. "I know, but what choice do I have? Either I accept his help or we all lose everything." Martha reached over and patted her hand. "Your father always said you had the best instincts of anyone he knew. What do your instincts tell you about this man?" Grace thought of Samuel's steady hand over hers, the quiet compassion in his eyes. "That he might be exactly what he seems, a businessman who sees value in this land. Or," she hesitated, Martha prompted, "or he might be something I can't afford to hope for a good man." The next morning, Grace arrived at the bank precisely at 9 o'clock. She'd barely slept, weighing her options and Samuel's offer from every angle. In the end, she decided she had nothing left to lose by hearing him out further. Samuel was already waiting outside, his tall frame leaning against a hitching post. When he saw her approaching, he straightened, removing his hat. "Miss Daniels," he greeted her, "I'm glad you came." "I haven't agreed to anything yet, Mr. Webster," she reminded him. "I'd like to hear more details about this partnership you're proposing." "Of course," he said. "Shall we discuss it inside with Mr. Prescott present? That way, everything will be above board." Grace nodded, and they entered the bank together. Mr. Prescott was visibly surprised to see them return together, but quickly ushered them into his office. "Miss Daniels, Mr. Webster," he said, indicating they should sit. "How may I help you today?" "I understand you're foreclosing on Miss Daniels' property," Samuel began without preamble. "I'd like to know the exact amount required to satisfy her debt to Wells Fargo." Prescott's eyebrows rose as he shuffled through some papers. "The outstanding loan amount is $1,200, plus $85 in interest and fees." Samuel nodded. "And if that amount were paid in full today?" "Then the property would remain in Miss Daniels' name, free and clear," Prescott replied, his curiosity evident. "Are you suggesting I'm proposing a business arrangement with Miss Daniels?" Samuel interrupted smoothly. "But before we proceed, I'd like to examine the original loan documents." Prescott hesitated but retrieved the documents from a filing cabinet. As Samuel reviewed them, Grace watched his face carefully. His expression remained impassive until he reached the final page. "Miss Daniels," he said quietly, "did you review these terms when you took over your father's loan?" Grace shook her head. Mr. Prescott's predecessor handled it. He said everything was standard. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Prescott, I believe there's been an error in calculating the interest. According to these terms, the rate should have been 5% annually, but you appear to have charged 8%. Prescott sputtered. "I'm sure that's not." "Furthermore," Samuel continued, his voice taking on a steely edge, "there's a clause here stating that in the event of a drought declared by the territorial governor, payments may be deferred for up to 6 months without penalty. Governor Thompson made such a declaration 3 months ago." Grace stared at Samuel in shock, then at Prescott, whose face had gone pale. "Is this true?" she demanded. "I may have overlooked that clause," Prescott admitted reluctantly. "Recalculate the amount due, please," Samuel said, his tone making it clear this was not a request. When Prescott finished his calculations, the new amount was substantially lower, $987 total. Without a word, Samuel removed an envelope from his jacket and counted out the exact amount in cash. "This satisfies Miss Daniels' debt in full," he said, placing the money on the desk. "Now, we'd like to discuss a new arrangement." Over the next hour, Samuel outlined his proposal. He would invest an additional $1,500 in the ranch for improvements, new breeding stock, repairs to the irrigation system, and wages for the hands during the lean months ahead. In return, he would receive 20% of the profits for 5 years, after which Grace would have the option to buy out his share at a predetermined price. Throughout the negotiation, Grace was impressed by Samuel's knowledge of ranching and his fairness. He insisted on terms that protected her interests as much as his own, and by the time they were ready to sign the new agreement, her initial suspicion had given way to cautious optimism. When the paperwork was ready, Prescott pushed it across the desk. Grace's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the pen, the magnitude of the moment overwhelming her. Just as she had the day before, Samuel steadied her hand with his own. "Take your time," he said softly. "Make sure everything is as you want it." Grace read through the agreement carefully before signing her name with a steady hand. Samuel signed next, and Prescott witnessed both signatures. "Congratulations on your new partnership," Prescott said stiffly, clearly displeased at the turn of events. Outside the bank, Grace turned to Samuel, struggling to find words adequate to express her gratitude and confusion. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why go to all this trouble for a stranger?" Samuel's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Perhaps I'd like the opportunity to become more than strangers, Miss Daniels. Would you do me the honor of having dinner with me this evening? To celebrate our new business arrangement, of course." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "I'd like that, Mr. Webster. Though I should warn you, Martha will be watching you like a hawk. She's very protective." "As she should be," Samuel replied. "I look forward to meeting her and earning her trust. Shall I pick you up at your ranch at 6? Grace nodded, suddenly feeling lighter than she had in months. "I'll be ready." True to his word, Samuel arrived at exactly 6 o'clock that evening. He'd exchanged his work clothes for a clean white shirt, black vest, and polished boots. His hat was new too, or at least newly brushed. Martha answered the door, subjecting him to a thorough inspection before grudgingly inviting him in. "Miss Grace is almost ready," she informed him. "You can wait in the parlor." Samuel thanked her politely and followed her to the small but tidy parlor. Martha didn't leave immediately as he expected, but instead fixed him with a stern gaze. "I don't know what your intentions are toward Miss Grace," she said bluntly, "but that girl has had enough heartache to last a lifetime. Her father dying, her brother lost in the war, and now nearly losing this ranch. She doesn't need any more trouble." "No, madam, she doesn't," Samuel agreed seriously, "and I have no intention of bringing her any. My business proposal is genuine, as is my admiration for Miss Daniels." Martha studied him for a long moment before giving a short nod. "See that it stays that way," she said, finally leaving him alone. When Grace appeared a few minutes later, Samuel rose to his feet, momentarily speechless. She wore a simple dress of deep green that complemented her eyes, and her honey blonde hair was arranged in soft curls that framed her face. "You look beautiful, Miss Daniels," he said when he recovered his voice. "Thank you," she replied, a becoming blush coloring her cheeks. "And I think after today you might call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated as if testing the sound of it. "Then I insist you call me Samuel." They dined at the finest restaurant in Tulsa, which wasn't saying much for a frontier town, but the food was hearty and well prepared. Over dinner, they began to learn about each other beyond their business connection. Samuel told her about growing up in Colorado, the son of a silver miner who'd struck it moderately rich. He'd worked cattle drives since he was 16 and had saved carefully, supplementing his earnings with smart investments in mining equipment and eventually receiving an inheritance when his uncle passed. I always wanted my own ranch, he explained, but Colorado's getting crowded. When I heard about the opportunities in Oklahoma Territory, I decided to see for myself. And what do you think of our territory so far? Grace asked, genuinely curious. It's beautiful country, Samuel said, his eyes never leaving her face. More beautiful than I expected. Grace ducked her head, flustered by his obvious admiration. What about family? Do you have siblings? A shadow crossed Samuel's face. I had a younger sister, Sarah. She died of fever when she was 12. My parents are both gone now, too. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. I know how that feels. It's just me now, too, except for Martha and the Hands. They're like family. Tell me about your ranch, Samuel encouraged. How did your father come to settle here? Grace's face lit up as she spoke about her father's journey from Tennessee after the Civil War, how he'd built the ranch from nothing, and her own dreams for its future. Samuel listened attentively, asking intelligent questions that showed genuine interest. The evening passed quickly, and when Samuel escorted her home, he hesitated at her porch steps. I enjoyed tonight very much, Grace, he said. Would it be too forward to ask if I might call on you again, not for business, but as a suitor? Grace felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. I'd like that, Samuel. He took her hand and raised it to his lips, the gesture old-fashioned but somehow perfectly suited to him. Good night, Grace. As she watched him ride away, Grace couldn't help but marvel at how dramatically her fortunes had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, she'd been facing ruin. Today, she had not only saved her ranch but possibly found something she'd long since stopped hoping for a chance at love. Over the next 2 months, Samuel proved himself to be everything he'd claimed and more. He worked alongside the ranch hands, never asking them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He invested in quality breeding stock from Texas that would strengthen their herd. He helped design improvements to the irrigation system that would make the ranch more resilient to future droughts. And he courted Grace with a patient determination that gradually wore down her carefully constructed defenses. They rode the property together, picnicked by the creek that marked the northern boundary, and attended Sunday services side by side. In the evenings, they often sat on her porch, talking until the stars came out. Martha watched their growing attachment with cautious approval. He's not what I expected, she admitted to Grace one evening as they prepared dinner. Samuel was due to join them after checking on a pregnant mare in the far pasture. What did you expect? Grace asked, kneading dough for biscuits. Some slick, talking city man looking to take advantage, Martha said frankly. But he works harder than men half his age, and he looks at you like you hung the moon. Grace smiled, unable to deny the happiness that had been growing within her. He's a good man, Martha, better than I dared hope for. Your father would have liked him, Martha said, which was perhaps the highest compliment she could give. When Samuel arrived for dinner, his shirt was dusty and his hair wind-tousled, but his smile when he saw Grace was as bright as ever. How's Starlight? Grace asked as they sat down to eat. Doing fine. The foal should come within the week, Samuel replied, accepting the plate Martha handed him with thanks. I was thinking we might ride out to Blackwater Canyon tomorrow if you're free. The wildflowers should be blooming now that we've had some rain. I'd like that, Grace said, looking forward to the excursion. The next day dawned clear and mild, perfect for riding. They packed a simple lunch and set out after the morning chores were complete. Blackwater Canyon was on the western edge of Grace's property, a dramatic geological feature where the land suddenly dropped away to reveal layered red rock and a small, spring-fed stream. They tethered their horses in a shady spot and spread a blanket near the canyon's edge where wildflowers created a natural carpet of purple and yellow blooms. As they ate their lunch, Samuel seemed unusually quiet. Is something troubling you? Grace asked finally, concerned by his pensive mood. Samuel met her gaze, his blue eyes serious. Not troubling exactly. I've been thinking about the future, Grace, our future. Grace's heart quickened. Oh, "These past 2 months have been the happiest of my life," he said, taking her hand in his. "I came to Oklahoma looking for land and opportunity. I never expected to find someone like you." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "I've been carrying this around for a week, waiting for the right moment." From the pouch, he produced a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Grace Daniels, I love you. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Grace's eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of overwhelming joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Samuel, I will marry you." His smile rivaled the sun as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a tender kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership. Their wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small white church in Tulsa. The entire town turned out for the celebration, curious about the handsome stranger who had not only saved the Daniels ranch, but had won the heart of one of their own. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered by Martha's skilled hands. Samuel stood tall and proud at the altar, his eyes never leaving Grace as she walked down the aisle on the arm of Chuck, the oldest ranch hand, who had tearfully accepted the honor of giving her away. As they exchanged vows, Grace thought of how close she had come to losing everything, how a chance encounter and a moment of kindness had changed the course of her life. When Samuel slipped the wedding band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, her hands were steady and sure. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up under the oak trees and lanterns hanging from the branches. There was music and dancing, good food and better company. As twilight settled over the land, Samuel led Grace away from the celebration to the privacy of the garden behind the house. "Happy, Mrs. Webster?" he asked, drawing her into his arms. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully, resting her head against his chest. "Thank you for steadying my hands that day at the bank, for giving me time when I needed it most." Samuel tilted her chin up so he could see her eyes. "I knew from that first moment that you were someone special, Grace, someone worth waiting for, worth fighting for. And now we have a lifetime together," she said softly. "A lifetime," he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss as the stars began to appear overhead, witnesses to the beginning of their journey together. In the years that followed, the Webster Ranch, as it came to be known, though the legal documents still bore both their names, prospered beyond their expectations. The drought ended, and with Samuel's investments and Grace's knowledge of the land, their cattle operation became one of the most successful in the territory. They welcomed their first child, a son they named James, after Grace's father, just over a year after their wedding. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and finally another son, Thomas, completed their family. The children grew up strong and healthy, learning the ways of the ranch and the value of hard work and integrity from both their parents. Martha remained with them, becoming grandma to the children in all but blood. The ranch hands who had stayed loyal through the hard times were rewarded with generous wages, and for those who wished it, small parcels of land to call their own. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Samuel surprised Grace with a new house larger and more comfortable than the original homestead, but built on the same spot, incorporating parts of the old structure so that the past remained honored even as they embraced the future. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together on the wide porch of their new home, Grace's head resting on Samuel's shoulder as they gazed out at the land they had nurtured together. "You ever think about that day at the bank?" Samuel asked, his arm around her waist. "How different things might have been if I hadn't walked in at that exact moment." Grace looked up at him, at the face she had come to know as well as her own, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper now but still crinkling when he smiled. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens," she said. "But I thank God every day that you came into my life when you did, Samuel Webster. And I thank him for giving me the sense to recognize the treasure standing right in front of me," Samuel replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I love you, Grace. More today than yesterday, but not as much as I will tomorrow." As they sealed their renewed commitment with a kiss, the Oklahoma sky spread vast and star-filled above them, and the land stretched wide around them, the land they had saved together, where they had built a life, a family, and a love that would endure far beyond their time on this earth. And whenever Grace thought back to that moment in the bank when her hands had trembled with fear and loss, she remembered too the steady strength that had come to her aid, the patient voice that had given her time to breathe, to think, to hope. In that moment of compassion, the seeds of their future had been planted, a future neither of them could have imagined, but that they had cultivated together, season after season, through drought and plenty, through joy and sorrow, through all the days of their lives.